Question number 5. Cardiomyocyte action potential. The types of action potential, AP, of cardiac muscle are very different. But there are two main types. The cardiac action potential is a brief change in voltage, membrane potential, across the cell membrane of heart cells. This is caused by the movement of charged atoms, called ions, between the inside and outside of the cell, through proteins called ion channels. The cardiac action potential differs from action potentials found in other types of electrically excitable cells, such as nerves. Action potentials also vary within the heart. This is due to the presence of different ion channels in different cells. The picture shows different shapes of the cardiac action potential in various parts of the heart. There are two main types. Fast responses, left. Myocardial and Purkinje fibers. Slow responses, right. SA and AV nodes. Myocardiocyte action potentials have a significantly longer duration than the spike-shaped action potentials of neurons and skeletal myocytes. The standard model used to understand the cardiac action potential is that of the ventricular myocyte. Outlined below are the 5 phases of the ventricular myocyte action potential. Standard model of the fast response cardiomyocyte action potential. Phase 0, rapid depolarization. Phase 1, initial repolarization. Phase 2, plateau phase. Phase 3, repolarization. Phase 4, resting potential. Fast AP and its ionic basis. You should be able to draw this diagram. Phase 0. This phase consists of a rapid, positive change in voltage across the cell membrane, depolarization, lasting less than 2 milliseconds in ventricular cells. This occurs due to a net flow of positive charge into the cell. In non-pacemaker cells, i.e. ventricular cells, this is produced predominantly by the activation of sodium ions channels, which increases the membrane conductance, flow, of sodium ions, G-sodium. Sodium ion channels are activated when an action potential arrives from a neighboring cell, through gap junctions. When this happens, the voltage within the cell increases slightly. If this increased voltage reaches the threshold potential, approximately -70 mV, it causes the sodium ion channels to open. This produces a larger influx of sodium into the cell, rapidly increasing the voltage further to around +50 mV, towards the sodium ion equilibrium potential. However, if the initial stimulus is not strong enough, and the threshold potential is not reached, the rapid sodium channels will not be activated and an action potential will not be produced. This is known as the all or none law. The influx of calcium ions through L-type calcium channels also constitutes a minor part of the depolarization effect. The slope of phase 0 on the action potential waveform, see figure, represents the maximum rate of voltage change of the cardiac action potential and is known as dV/Tmax. First phase. This phase begins with the rapid inactivation of the sodium ions channels by the inner gate, inactivation gate, reducing the movement of sodium into the cell. At the same time, potassium channels, called ITO1, open and close rapidly, allowing for a brief flow of potassium ions out of the cell, making the membrane potential slightly more negative. This is referred to as a notch on the action potential waveform. Phase 2. This phase is also known as the plateau phase due to the membrane potential remaining almost constant, as the membrane slowly begins to repolarize. This is due to the near balance of charge moving into and out of the cell. During this phase, delayed rectifier potassium channels, X, allow potassium to leave the cell, while L-type calcium channels, activated by the influx of sodium during phase 0, allow the movement of calcium ions into the cell. These calcium ions bind to and open more calcium channels, called ryanodine receptors, located on the sarcoplasmic reticulum within the cell, allowing the flow of calcium out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, SR. These calcium ions are responsible for the contraction of the heart. Phase 2. Calcium also activates chloride channels called ITO2, which allow chloride to enter the cell. Increased calcium concentration in the cell also increases activity of the sodium-calcium exchangers, while increased sodium concentration, from the depolarization of phase 0, increases activity of the sodium-potassium pumps. The movement of all these ions results in the membrane potential remaining relatively constant, with potassium ions outflux, chloride influx as well as sodium-potassium pumps contributing to repolarization, and calcium influx as well as sodium-calcium exchangers contributing to depolarization. This phase is responsible for the large duration of the action potential and is important in preventing irregular heartbeat, cardiac arrhythmia. During phase 3, the rapid repolarization phase of the action potential, the L-type calcium ion channels close, while the slow delayed rectifier X potassium channels remain open as more potassium leak channels open. This ensures a net outward positive current, corresponding to negative change in membrane potential, thus allowing more types of potassium channels to open. These are primarily the rapid delayed rectifier potassium channels, IKR, and the inwardly rectifying potassium current, IK1. This net outward, positive current, equal to loss of positive charge from the cell, causes the cell to repolarize. The delayed rectifier potassium channels close when the membrane potential is restored to about -85 to -90 MV, while IK1 remains conducting throughout phase 4, which helps to set the resting membrane potential. Ionic pumps, as discussed above, like the sodium-calcium exchanger and the sodium-potassium pump, restore ion concentrations back to balanced states pre-action potential. This means that the intracellular calcium is pumped out, which was responsible for cardiac myocyte contraction. Once this is lost, the contraction stops and the heart muscles relax. Phase 4. In the ventricular myocyte, phase 4 occurs when the cell is at rest, in a period known as diastole. In the standard non-pacemaker cell, the voltage during this phase is more or less constant, at roughly -90 mV. The resting membrane potential results from the flux of ions having flowed into the cell, e.g. sodium and calcium, the flux of ions having flowed out of the cell, e.g. potassium, chloride, and bicarbonate, as well as the flux of ions generated by the different membrane pumps, being perfectly balanced. The activity of these pumps serve two purposes. The first is to maintain the existence of the resting membrane potential by countering the depolarization due to the leakage of ions not at the electrochemical equilibrium, e.g. sodium and calcium. These ions not being at the equilibrium is the reason for the existence of an electrical gradient, for they represent a net displacement of charges across the membrane, which are unable to immediately re-enter the cell to restore the electrical equilibrium. Therefore, their slow re-entrance in the cell needs to be counterbalanced, or the cell would slowly lose its membrane potential. The second purpose, intricately linked to the first, is to keep the intracellular concentration more or less constant, and in this case to re-establish the original chemical gradients, that is to force the sodium and calcium which previously flowed into the cell out of it, and the potassium which previously flowed out of the cell back into it, though as the potassium is mostly at the electrochemical equilibrium, its chemical gradient will naturally re-equilibrate itself opposite to the electrical gradient, without the need for an active transport mechanism. During this phase the membrane is most permeable to potassium, which can travel into or out of cell through leak channels, including the inwardly rectifying potassium channel. Therefore, the resting membrane potential is mostly equal to potassium ion equilibrium potential and can be calculated using the Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz voltage equation. Slow action potential. Phase 0, depolarization, increased calcium ion and decreased potassium ion conductances. Phase 3, repolarization, increased potassium ion and decreased calcium ion conductances. Phase 4, spontaneous depolarization, funny currents, if, through slow sodium ion channels, increased calcium ion and decreased potassium ion conductances. Designate the phases of the slow action potential only as 0, 3, 4. Slow AP and its ionic basis. You must learn this diagram and be able to draw it. Phase 0. In pacemaker cells, e.g. sinoatrial node cells, the increase in membrane voltage is mainly due to activation of L-type calcium channels. These channels are also activated by an increase in voltage, however this time it is either due to the pacemaker potential, phase 4, or an oncoming action potential. The L-type calcium channels are activated more slowly than the sodium channels, therefore, the depolarization slope in the pacemaker action potential waveform is less steep than that in the non-pacemaker action potential waveform. There is no obvious phases 1 and 2 present in pacemaker cells. Phase 3. In the sinoatrial node, this phase is also due to the closure of the L-type calcium channels, preventing inward flux of calcium ion and the opening of the rapid delayed rectifier potassium channels, I-K-R. Phase 4. In the ventricular myocyte, phase 4 occurs when the cell is at rest, in a period known as diastole. In the standard non-pacemaker cell, the voltage during this phase is more or less constant, at roughly -90 mV. The resting membrane potential results from the flux of ions having flowed into the cell, e.g. sodium and calcium, the flux of ions having flowed out of the cell, e.g. potassium, chloride, and bicarbonate, as well as the flux of ions generated by the different membrane pumps, being perfectly balanced. The activity of these pumps serve two purposes. The first is to maintain the existence of the resting membrane potential by countering the depolarization due to the leakage of ions not at the electrochemical equilibrium, e.g. sodium and calcium. These ions not being at the equilibrium is the reason for the existence of an electrical gradient, for they represent a net displacement of charges across the membrane, which are unable to immediately re-enter the cell to restore the electrical equilibrium. Therefore, their slow re-entrance in the cell needs to be counterbalanced, or the cell would slowly lose its membrane potential.